Thanks so much, Joel. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. As was mentioned, I'm going to be covering two topics today, and the first that I'm going to start with is workplace investigations into whistleblower complaints. So one of the things that we want to keep in mind, as you all know from your own workplace experience, is that conduct issues have persisted throughout the pandemic. They morphed in a number of ways. Early on in the pandemic, we saw more remote misconduct, behaviors that could arguably constitute cyberbullying. And with returns to the office, now people are again in closer physical proximity. For some workplace environments, that's been great. We've been enjoying seeing each other again, having the benefit of being together to collaborate more closely. But for others where the dynamics may have historically been more dysfunctional, it can be a problem. And the key thing to note there is that, as Laura mentioned, workplaces now are contending with a mental health echo pandemic, really. People have been through a lot, and that can manifest as misconduct or as zero tolerance for perceived misconduct. And these have bubbled up through workplace complaints. So when we're diving into the developments in terms of workplace investigations and whistleblower complaints, we're considering how these things are bubbling up. And in workplaces that have whistleblower policies, these complaints sometimes come up through these avenues. Now, whistleblower policies can be very, very useful. They provide a confidential mechanism for employees to disclose potential illicit activities in the organization, which means you can expose inappropriate conduct, encourage a culture of accountability and transparency and general trust in the organization, because you're telling people, you don't tolerate these sorts of things. However, they're really not a good mechanism for investigating workplace bullying, discrimination, and/or harassment. And they can't be conflated with or used in place of policies and procedures that specifically deal with this type of misconduct. And I'll give you an example. We were engaged by a Crown corporation to investigate allegations of harassment and discrimination going back a number of years, which had come up through the whistleblower policy that the organization had in place. Now, the whistleblower policy guaranteed anonymity. So immediately from an investigating harassment and discrimination perspective, you run into some problems. You don't know the identity of the complainant, which means often you're left with just the initial complaint that they've given you. You don't have an opportunity to conduct a full intake. You also can't tell the respondent, this is who made the complaint. And that can make procedural fairness in an investigation process quite difficult. The respondent is, after all, entitled to a certain level of detail to actually be able to provide a full and fair response to the allegations. And this level of detail is going to generally include who the interactions were allegedly with. And the standards for what's required to ensure that an investigation is procedurally fair are quite high and have been subject to ever greater scrutiny by decision makers. Also, in this particular circumstance we were dealing with, some of the allegations, as I mentioned, were quite historical. Investigating historical allegations is difficult anyway because passage of time impacts memory. It means that maybe people who are around for the events in question aren't around anymore or aren't inclined to talk about them. But it's very, very difficult to look into when the allegations are under particularized and you don't have the opportunity to do a full intake with the complainant so you can get details to put to the respondent. Now, in this case, there were a few details in the allegations that made the complainant identifiable to the respondent, and it made it possible to conduct a thorough process that was procedurally fair, partially by starting with some preliminary questions, providing the respondent with the allegations in advance and saying, do you know who these allegations are from? And they were able to say yes, and we were able to move on with the process. So given some of these complexities, what should you as an employer do to avoid potential liabilities and pitfalls? Really, there are a couple of key takeaways that I'd like to leave you with when dealing with these types of issues. And the first is review current systems and processes. Ensure that if you have a whistleblower policy, it's quite separate from harassment and discrimination policies and escalation procedures. And part of making sure that you have those policies properly in place is also ensuring they've been thoroughly socialized. You want to clearly communicate why whistleblower policies aren't a great venue for these types of complaints. Not that you don't want to hear about these types of issues, but you want to hear about them in a way that's going to allow you to address them in a robust, procedurally fair way. And not having them brought up in the appropriate avenues can actually undermine the organization's ability to carry out a full investigation that can potentially lead to allegations being substantiated, which, if that happens, leads to employees thinking, well, you weren't really serious about this. I know this is true. This is what I experienced, and you found that it was unsubstantiated. Allowing things to escalate in a way that doesn't set you up for success in dealing with them can really undermine the intentions behind and the efficacy of the whole process. Employers would also be well advised to obtain legal advice to minimize exposure to costly legal liabilities. So you want to see what measures you can take to set yourself up for success, as I mentioned, to address the issues as well as possible. And that might ensure training, include ensuring training for whoever is actually responsible for triaging your whistleblower complaints, to, for example, try to get in touch with the complainant right away. Follow up if they've left, even a clearly temporary, not permanent or not official email address. See if they're willing to talk. Sometimes it doesn't work. But it can be helpful, and we've actually seen this be a successful practice with clients who've received whistleblower complaints. So you always want to see if you can get that more information, because anything additional that you can get will make addressing these types of issues that you're required to address easier. And you always want to make sure you're ensuring procedural fairness for the respondent and for the complainant. Investigations aren't a gotcha exercise. Parties should have all the information necessary to provide a full picture of their perspective on the interactions in question. And this includes the complainant having an opportunity to particularize their allegations and the respondent hearing those particulars. And for serious and complex allegations, organizations should consider retaining an independent investigator with expertise in dealing with the nature of the allegations. Investigations are getting more complex. Types of behaviors complained about are getting more nuanced. And frequently in our practice, we've seen the types of complaints raised in this way through whistleblower policies to be things like complaints of systemic discrimination, which are very difficult to investigate even in the best of circumstances with the most transparency. But when brought through improper channels, they're much more difficult even than the standard. So you want to ensure that nothing is missed and that the process is dealt with as efficiently as possible, which sometimes means outsourcing it if there isn't internal capacity to deal with it. And this actually brings me to the other topic that I want to discuss with you, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion in today's workplace environment. And this is often conflated with addressing complaints of discrimination or discriminatory harassment, but it's actually a much more multifaceted approach that's required in these types of circumstances. So in terms of, the setting the scene, as Laura mentioned, we're in a particular moment now when it comes to awareness of and focus on EDI in the workplace. Social movement activity and high-profile cases over the last few years have brought this to the forefront, to the point where candidates, as was mentioned, are asking about EDI and rejecting positions at organizations where they don't find it to be a priority. And so when it comes to EDI in the workplace, considerations impact every step of the employment life cycle, from attraction and recruitment through maintenance and management of the employment relationship, and then at the cessation of the employment relationship. And because the ways these issues manifest are varied and complex, I want to take some time to go through some examples of how we've seen this manifest, because I think it's really important to contextualize it rather than speak in the abstract. For example, we assisted a governmental organization with an organizational review into recruitment and hiring. And allegations were made that there were systemic barriers to promotion and advancement for certain groups of employees related to protected grounds under human rights legislation. Not necessarily that people weren't being hired, though diversity was an issue, but really that once they were there, they weren't being set up for success. They didn't have opportunity for promotion, advancement, and there was no representation at senior leadership levels. Another place where we've seen these issues come up is in the context of revising policies from an EDI perspective to ensure they're inclusive. For example, we're currently involved in several rounds of collective bargaining, where one of the important strategies is to build momentum by getting agreement on things that both the employer and the union can be on the same page on and support. And one of the things we found has been really effective is revising articles from an EDI lens in the collective agreement. And sometimes it's as simple as starting off with changing some gendered language to gender neutral language to ensure that nobody is being inadvertently excluded. That could be as simple as changing, a collective agreement that usually says he or he or she to they. And we've also seen this in the context of workplace complaints. For example, in a post-secondary setting, a conflict arose because certain employees described a colleague who's disorganized and late in providing work as lazy. He happens to be the only Black employee in the department, and when others identified this as a microaggression based on stereotypes because white colleagues who performed work in the same way were never described in the same way, this was met with denial and anger. And these are just a couple of the examples that we could go through, because there are so many potential issues for employers to navigate. And as sensitivity increases to these issues, both from employers, managers, employees, so do the consequences of mishandling them. This includes, financial costs when you mishandle these types of issues, because they're, again, tied to discrimination, harassment, but also reputational consequences as people become more and more inclined to publicize workplace issues in traditional media and on social media. So in terms of how to address these issues, as I mentioned, they can occur at all points in the employment relationship. So the solutions have to be similarly comprehensive. And as Laura mentioned, when you're dealing with EDI, you want to make sure you're intentional, you're sincere, and you're all hands on deck. But how do you actually action that? There are a couple of takeaways that we've identified, and they start with the fact that employers would be well advised to develop, and if you already have one, revisit the organization's EDI strategy. What did you actually commit to? Does it still make sense? And have you been keeping track of what employee reactions have been? Have they bought into this? Do they feel that the organization has work to do? These are all things that you want to keep in mind to make sure that you're staying on track and not exposing yourself to some of the potential pitfalls I mentioned. You also want to assess what resources you've allocated, and if necessary, allocate additional resources. Mishandling these issues by not dedicating sufficient resources can be very harmful. For example, in the educational context, we were dealing with an organization that really wanted to proactively focus on EDI. They created an equity office, they hired an equity officer, they advertised that was who complaints were to go to, but they didn't hire a staff to support the equity office. The equity officer got flooded with complaints. The complaints couldn't be addressed in a timely manner, and ultimately employees lost faith in the position and in the organization's sincerity in dealing with these issues. And it took a lot of work to restore the workplace and come back from that misstep. You also want to make sure that you're being transparent about vulnerabilities and plans to address them. Sometimes we hear from organizations, everything's great, there's nothing to be done. It's just going to take some time for the things that we've put in place to work their way through. And that, always gets our antenna up a little bit, because even if you're perfectly diverse and inclusive, and that would be, quite the workplace, workplaces don't exist in isolation. Employees interact with customers, vendors, members of the public, and you can't control these interactions. But also everybody brings their own lived experience to the workplace, and that can color perceptions of certain conduct. So when you do identify that there are issues, when concerns are brought to your attention, you want to make sure that you're acknowledging, yes, there's work to be done, but here's our plan and here's how we intend to do it. And finally, it may be advisable to undertake a review to get a really firm handle on the pulse of the workplace and some things that may be blind spots. For example, in one of the workplaces where we were told everything is good, we're diverse, we're inclusive, we're open to feedback, nothing to see here, there was a complaint raised of systemic discrimination that was raised in a public forum. And one of the senior leaders of the organization responded by saying, "This is entirely baseless. I don't know where this is coming from, and the person who brought this forward should be disciplined." It wasn't until the actual review process that people in charge, the people leaders at the organization, and employees really became aware of what had happened, but also felt comfortable sharing their actual perceptions of the workplace environment on a broad scale. And so these types of processes can really help employers plan next steps and set themselves up for success. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to take us into the Q&A portion of our webinar.